The lawyer was less than 60 seconds away from closing my father's file when a single question changed everything. My name is Susan Carter. I am 69 years old, a retired teacher, and until that afternoon, I believed the final chapter of my father's life had already been written. For months had passed since William Carter died. The grief had settled into something quieter, but not easier. I still reached for the phone some mornings before remembering he was gone. I still caught myself saving stories to tell him. And I still struggled to understand why the weeks following his funeral felt so strange. The meeting took place in a downtown law office where my father had handled his estate planning for years. Family members filled the conference room. My younger brother, Michael, sat near the head of the table. Several cousins occupied the remaining chairs. Attorney David Reynolds reviewed a stack of documents while speaking in the calm, professional tone lawyers seemed to master over decades. The estate itself was straightforward. My father had never been wealthy, but he had been careful. He left behind a comfortable home, several investment accounts, and enough savings to ensure nobody would face hardship. What surprised me was not the distribution of assets. What surprised me was the complete absence of anything personal. My father was a man who wrote everything down. Birthday cards contained full pages of handwritten thoughts. Holiday letters arrived every December without fail. He kept journals, notes, reminders, and carefully labeled folders. Yet according to everything we had been told, he left no personal message for me. Not a letter, not a note, not even a final written goodbye. The idea never felt right. David continued reviewing paperwork. Around the room, family members appeared ready to move forward. Michael especially seemed eager to close the matter. Whenever questions arose during previous meetings, he always had an answer prepared. Whenever someone referenced our father's final months, Michael somehow redirected the conversation elsewhere. I noticed the pattern, but I had no proof that it meant anything. If there are no further concerns, David said, glancing around the room, we can officially complete the remaining documentation and close the estate file. Several people nodded. Pens were lifted. Chairs shifted. The meeting appeared finished. Then an elderly man seated near the far end of the table raised his hand. It was Harold Jenkins, one of my father's closest friends. They had known each other for nearly 40 years. David paused. Yes, Harold. Harold looked confused. Before we finish, I have a question. The room quieted. What happened to Susan's letter? Every sound seemed to disappear. I stared at him. Across the table, Michael's expression changed so quickly that I almost missed it. A brief flash of tension crossed his face before he looked down at the documents in front of him. David frowned. What letter? Harold blinked. The one Bill told me about. My pulse immediately accelerated. What are you talking about? I asked. Harold turned toward me. About 6 weeks before he passed, your father told me he had written you a private letter. He said there were things he wanted you to understand after he was gone. Nobody spoke. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it. A letter? I repeated. Harold nodded. He seemed relieved after writing it. Said he finally put certain things into words. I looked directly at Michael. He avoided my eyes. David slowly removed his glasses. Susan, he said carefully, is this the first time you have heard about such a letter? Yes, I answered. The attorney glanced toward the estate file stacked beside him. Then he looked back at me, because I do not recall seeing any letter either. In that moment, the meeting stopped being about an estate. It stopped being about paperwork. Somewhere between my father's death and that conference room, a letter meant specifically for me had disappeared. And for the first time since the funeral, I realized the story my family had accepted might not be the truth at all. The meeting ended without anyone signing another document. What had been scheduled as a routine conclusion suddenly became something entirely different. People gathered their belongings slowly, exchanging uncertain glances as they left the conference room. Nobody seemed to know what to say. Harold Jenkins remained seated for a few moments, looking genuinely surprised by everyone's reaction. To him, the letter had never been a secret. He appeared to assume that I had received it months ago. As the room emptied, I approached him. Harold, I said carefully, can you tell me exactly what Dad told you? He nodded. We were having lunch at the diner on Maple Street. It was about 6 weeks before he passed away. His eyes drifted toward the window as he recalled the memory. He told me he had finally written something he had been meaning to write for years. He said it was only for you. My stomach tightened. Did he say what was in it? Harold shook his head. No. But he seemed relieved, almost peaceful. That answer stayed with me the entire drive home. My father was not a dramatic man. He believed in solving problems quietly. If he had taken the time to write a private letter, it mattered. More importantly, if Harold knew about it, then the letter had existed. It was not a rumor. It was not a misunderstanding. Somewhere between my father's desk and the estate process, the letter had vanished. That evening I called Michael. He answered on the third ring. "What do you want?" he asked. There was already irritation in his voice. "I want to know about the letter." Several seconds passed. "What letter?" "Dad's letter. The one Harold mentioned." Another pause. I have no idea what Harold was talking about. His response came too quickly. "You never heard Dad mention it?" I asked. "No. Not once. No." I sat quietly for a moment. Michael had many habits. One of them was over-explaining when he told the truth. When he gave short answers, it usually meant he wanted a conversation to end. "That is strange," I said, because Harold seemed certain. Michael sighed heavily. "Susan, Dad is gone. People remember things incorrectly all the time." Then he changed the subject and asked about the house maintenance account. The shift felt unnatural. By the time we ended the call, I felt more unsettled than before. The following morning, I visited my father's house. It remained empty while the estate process continued. Walking through the front door still felt painful. His reading glasses rested beside his favorite chair exactly where he left them. The kitchen calendar remained open to the month before he passed away. Everywhere I looked, I saw evidence of the man he had been. Organized, careful, thoughtful. I spent several hours reviewing his office. Filing cabinets lined one wall. Every drawer contained labeled folders. Insurance records, tax documents, property information, medical papers. Everything was arranged with remarkable precision. That was when a realization struck me. My father never discarded important correspondence. Never. During my childhood, he saved report cards, letters, receipts, and family photographs dating back decades. A man like that would not write an important personal letter and leave no trace of it behind. As I continued searching, I discovered something else. Inside a notebook near his desk, several names appeared beside handwritten reminders. One entry immediately caught my attention. It was dated less than 2 months before his death. Next to attorney David Reynolds' name, my father had written 4 words. Confirm letter was copied. I stared at the page for nearly a full minute. Then I read it again. Confirm letter was copied. Suddenly the mystery became much larger. Because if my father wanted a copy made, then somewhere, another version of that missing letter might still exist. The notebook remained open on my father's desk long after the sun had begun to set. I sat in his office reading the same 4 words again and again. Confirm letter was copied. The sentence was short, but its implications were enormous. Until that moment, I had only been searching for a missing letter. Now I was searching for evidence that another version might still exist somewhere. My father rarely wrote reminders unless they involved something important. If he took the time to note that a copy needed to be confirmed, then preserving that letter mattered to him. The next morning, I called attorney David Reynolds. He agreed to meet later that afternoon. When I arrived at his office, I placed the notebook on his desk and pointed directly to the entry. David adjusted his glasses and studied the page carefully. "This is definitely your father's handwriting," he said. "There is no question about that. Do you remember anything about a copy?" I asked. He leaned back in his chair and thought for several moments. "Honestly, I do not. We handled a large number of documents during that period." My disappointment must have been visible because he quickly added, "But that does not mean the record is gone." For the next hour, David and I reviewed archived files connected to my father's estate planning. Most of the folders contained exactly what we expected. Property records, financial statements, insurance information. Nothing referenced a personal letter. Yet one detail immediately stood out. My father's file was significantly larger than average. He had a habit of documenting conversations, saving correspondence, and keeping written notes about important decisions. "Your father believed in paper trails," David said with a faint smile. I noticed that. Then David said something that stayed with me. "There is a phrase your father repeated whenever we discussed major decisions." I looked up. "What phrase?" David smiled. "The truth survives longer than secrets." For a moment, I simply stared at him. The sentence sounded exactly like something my father would say. Practical, direct, uncomplicated. David continued. He said it often, especially during the last year. Hearing those words gave me an unexpected sense of comfort. My father was no longer here, but pieces of him kept appearing through the memories of others. As the afternoon continued, David searched through older storage records. Most produced nothing useful. Then he paused in front of his computer screen. That is interesting. My heart immediately accelerated. What? He clicked several times before turning the monitor toward me. An internal archive entry appeared. The record itself was brief. It listed a meeting between my father and the law office approximately 7 weeks before his death. Beside the appointment was a notation. Supplemental correspondence retained. What does that mean? I asked. David frowned. Normally, it refers to additional materials kept separately from the main file. Like a letter? Possibly. For the first time since Harold mentioned the missing letter, I felt genuine hope. We finally had something more than memories and assumptions. We had documentation suggesting that extra correspondence once existed. The problem was that nobody knew where those materials had been stored. The archive system had changed twice over the years. Files had been relocated. Some had been digitized. Others remained boxed in storage. Finding one piece of correspondence among thousands of records would not be easy. As I prepared to leave, David promised to continue searching. It may take time, he said, but if your father wanted a copy preserved, there is a chance it survived. Driving home, I thought about the phrase he had shared. The truth survives longer than secrets. My father believed that. Somewhere, hidden within boxes, folders, or forgotten archives, the truth about that missing letter was waiting. And for the first time, I began to suspect that someone in my family already knew exactly what it said. The days that followed were filled with waiting, and I quickly discovered that waiting can be just as exhausting as searching. Every morning, I checked my phone hoping for an update from attorney David Reynolds. Every afternoon, I found myself replaying old conversations with my father, looking for clues I might have missed. The missing letter occupied my thoughts constantly. If my father had wanted it copied, then he expected it to survive. The question that haunted me was simple. Why had it never reached me? 3 days after our last meeting, David finally called. His voice sounded unusually serious. Susan, I think I found something you need to see. Less than an hour later, I was sitting across from him in his office. Several storage inventories were spread across his desk. David pointed to a highlighted entry buried deep within an archive report. This record was created shortly after your father's final meeting here, he explained. I leaned forward. The entry referenced supplemental correspondence, just as before. But this time there was additional information. A transfer authorization. Someone had requested that certain materials be moved from active files into long-term storage. Who made the request? I asked immediately. David hesitated. That is the part that concerns me. He turned the page. The authorization had been signed by an administrative employee who retired nearly 2 years ago. Yet beside the signature was another notation indicating that a family representative had reviewed the materials before the transfer occurred. My pulse quickened. Which family representative? David looked directly at me. The record does not say. The silence that followed felt heavy. For the first time, there was documentation suggesting that someone within the family may have known about the supplemental correspondence long before Harold mentioned the letter. It was not proof of wrongdoing, but it was enough to raise serious questions. Later that evening, I attended a small family dinner at my cousin Linda's house. News of the missing letter had quietly spread among relatives. Most people seemed curious. Others appeared uncomfortable. During dessert, one conversation unexpectedly changed everything. Linda's husband, Frank, mentioned something he remembered from several months before my father's passing. Your father asked me where I stored important papers, he said casually. I immediately looked up. What exactly did he ask? Frank shrugged. He wanted to know the safest way to make sure documents survived if something unexpected happened. My heart accelerated again. Did he mention a letter? Frank thought carefully. Not specifically, but he said there was something personal he wanted protected. Around the table, several relatives exchanged glances. Then something even stranger happened. My cousin Rachel quietly set down her coffee cup. I thought everyone knew about that. The room fell silent. Knew about what? I asked. Rachel looked confused by our reactions. A few weeks after Uncle William passed away, I overheard Michael arguing with someone on the phone about a letter. Every muscle in my body seemed to tighten. What kind of argument? Rachel shook her head. I do not know. I only caught part of the conversation. But I remember hearing him say that some things were better left alone. Nobody spoke. The words hung in the air. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe there was not. Either way, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The next morning, I shared everything with David. He listened carefully before opening a folder on his desk. Then he revealed another development. The retired employee who processed the transfer authorization had finally been located. She agreed to speak with him later that week. If her memory remained clear, she might explain exactly what happened to the supplemental correspondence. As I left his office, I thought again about my father's favorite phrase. The truth survives longer than secrets. For months, the truth had remained hidden. But now the secrets surrounding that missing letter were beginning to crack. And somewhere behind them was the answer my father had tried so hard to preserve. 3 days later, attorney David Reynolds called before sunrise. The moment I heard his voice, I knew something important had happened. "Susan," he said, "I spoke with the retired employee." I sat upright in bed. "What did she say?" There was a pause. More than I expected. Less than 2 hours later, I was sitting in his office again. David had a legal pad filled with notes. The retired employee's name was Carol Whitaker. She had worked for the firm for nearly 20 years before retiring. At first, she remembered very little about my father's file. Then David mentioned the supplemental correspondence. According to Carol, that detail triggered a specific memory. "She remembered your father clearly," David explained. "Apparently, he was one of the most organized clients she ever worked with." That sounded exactly like him. David continued. "Carol said your father personally requested that a copy of a private letter be stored separately from the main estate documents." My pulse quickened immediately. A copy definitely existed? Yes. For several seconds, I simply stared at him. Months of uncertainty suddenly gave way to confirmation. The missing letter had never been a rumor. It had never been a misunderstanding. It was real. More importantly, a copy had once been preserved by the law office itself. "Then where is it?" I asked. David exhaled slowly. "That is where things become complicated." According to Carol, the copy had been placed in a supplemental correspondence file rather than the estate file. Several months later, during a records transition, multiple supplemental files were transferred into long-term storage. Normally the process was routine, but Carol remembered something unusual. Someone had specifically asked whether your father's supplemental file contained personal materials. My stomach tightened. "Who?" David shook his head. She could not remember the name. The frustration was immediate. We were finally getting answers, yet the most important detail remained missing. Still, Carol remembered one thing with remarkable clarity. The inquiry came from a family member rather than a legal professional. As I drove home afterward, I kept replaying those words. Family member. The circle of possibilities was becoming smaller. That evening, Michael unexpectedly called me. We had spoken very little since Harold revealed the existence of the letter. "How are you doing?" he asked. The question sounded almost rehearsed. "I have been better," I replied. A brief silence followed. Then he said something that caught my attention immediately. "You are spending a lot of energy chasing old paperwork." I felt my grip tighten around the phone. Maybe because Dad wanted me to have it. Another pause. Longer this time. "You do not know that." His answer came quietly. "Actually, I do know that a letter existed." The silence on the other end was immediate. For several seconds, Michael said nothing at all. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different. Less confident. "Who told you that?" he asked. It was not a denial. It was not surprise. It was a question. And in that moment, I realized something important. Michael had never once reacted like someone hearing about the letter for the first time. He reacted like someone worried about what I might discover next. After we ended the call, I sat alone in my living room thinking about our father. I remembered something he told me years earlier after a difficult disagreement within the family. He looked at me and said, "The truth survives longer than secrets." At the time, I thought he was offering advice. Now I wondered if he was leaving behind a warning. The next afternoon, David called again. His voice carried an excitement I had never heard before. "Susan," he said, "one of the storage facilities finally responded." My heart immediately began racing. Then he delivered the news that changed everything. A supplemental correspondence box connected to your father's records had been located, and according to the inventory list, it had not been opened in more than 4 years. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the contents of the missing letter. For months, I had struggled to understand why my father's final wishes seemed incomplete. Now, for the first time, there was a real possibility that answers had been sitting inside a storage box all along. The following morning, I met attorney David Reynolds outside a records facility located nearly 40 miles from downtown. The building itself was unremarkable, a large warehouse surrounded by chain-link fencing and loading docks. Yet somewhere inside, hidden among thousands of archived files, might be the document my father intended me to receive. David had already completed the necessary authorization paperwork. A records manager escorted us through several security checkpoints before leading us into a climate-controlled storage area filled with endless rows of shelves. Box after box stretched into the distance. The entire place felt like a museum of forgotten histories. Eventually, the manager stopped beside a cart holding several archive containers. One box carried a label matching my father's file number. My pulse immediately accelerated. David carefully removed the lid while I stood beside him, trying to remain calm. Inside were folders, correspondence records, appointment notes, and copies of documents dating back years. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. We began reviewing the contents one folder at a time. Minutes passed, then nearly an hour. Several times I feared we had traveled all that way only to find another dead end. Then David froze. "Susan." I looked up immediately. He was holding a thin manila folder labeled Supplemental Correspondence. For a moment, neither of us spoke. David opened the folder slowly. Inside were several pieces of routine communication, appointment confirmations, administrative notes. Then, near the back, a single document protected inside a transparent sleeve. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. Across the top appeared my father's handwriting. Personal letter copy. For several seconds, I could not breathe. The letter was real. The copy existed exactly as my father intended. After months of uncertainty, we were finally looking at proof. David carefully removed the document and examined it. Then his expression changed. "There is something else here." He turned over the sleeve. Attached to the back was a small processing form completed by the law office years earlier. Near the bottom appeared a handwritten notation. "Client requested original delivered directly. Copy retained per instruction." My eyes widened. "Original delivered directly?" David nodded. "That is what it says." The words hit me harder than I expected. According to the records, my father had specifically arranged for the original letter to reach me. Not someday. Not after additional review. Directly. Which meant the disappearance of the letter could no longer be explained as an administrative mistake. Someone had interrupted the process. Someone had prevented the original from reaching its intended recipient. We returned to David's office later that afternoon. Neither of us opened the letter immediately. Instead, he insisted on documenting the discovery properly. Copies were made. Records were logged. Every step was carefully preserved. As we worked, I found myself staring at the envelope again and again. My father's handwriting was unmistakable. It felt as though he were reaching across time itself. Finally, after everything had been documented, David looked at me. "Are you ready?" I swallowed hard and nodded. He carefully opened the protective sleeve and unfolded the pages inside. The room became completely silent. For months, I had searched for this moment. The letter my father wrote. The letter someone tried to keep from me. The letter that might explain everything. David lowered his eyes to the first page and began reading. Within the first few lines, I realized that what my father had written was even more important than I had ever imagined. David's voice remained calm as he began reading, but I could hear emotion beneath the professionalism. The first lines were not about money, property, or legal instructions. They were about family. My father had written the letter directly to me. Every sentence carried the warmth and honesty that defined him throughout his life. "Susan," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am no longer able to tell you these things myself." Tears immediately filled my eyes. I had spent months wondering why my father left without saying goodbye. Now, suddenly, his voice was back. David continued reading. My father spoke about memories from my childhood. He remembered helping me prepare for my first day of school. He remembered late-night conversations after my mother passed away years earlier. He remembered how often I placed the needs of others ahead of my own. None of it felt like a legal document. It felt like a father speaking honestly to his daughter one final time. Then the tone shifted. My father began discussing his concerns about the family. The room seemed to grow quieter with every sentence. "There may come a time when people disagree about what I wanted," he wrote. "If that happens, I want you to remember something important. The truth survives longer than secrets. Hearing those words inside the letter sent a chill through me. They were not simply a phrase he repeated. They were a message he deliberately chose to leave behind. David continued reading. According to the letter, my father had become increasingly worried during his final year. Not about his health, not about his finances, about misunderstandings developing within the family. He feared that assumptions, incomplete conversations, and private agendas could create divisions after he was gone. Then came the passage that changed everything. My father explained that he had spoken individually with several family members regarding his wishes. He specifically referenced conversations involving future decisions about the estate and family responsibilities. Most importantly, he made one point unmistakably clear. He never intended for information to be withheld from any member of the family. My pulse quickened as David reached the next page. My father then described why he wrote the letter. I am leaving this message because I believe honesty prevents confusion. If anyone ever tells you that I wanted secrets kept between my children, they are mistaken. For several seconds, neither David nor I spoke. The significance was impossible to ignore. The missing letter itself had become evidence, not because it changed the estate, not because it distributed assets differently, but because its disappearance directly contradicted the values my father described inside it. David resumed reading. Near the end, my father addressed me personally once again. He thanked me for years of support. He expressed pride in the life I built. He reminded me that difficult truths often take time to emerge. Then he included one final statement that left me speechless. If this letter does not reach you promptly, I trust that eventually the truth will find its way home. Tears streamed down my face. Somehow, years earlier, my father anticipated exactly what would happen. He understood that the message might face obstacles, yet he still believed the truth would survive. As David carefully folded the pages, neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, he looked at me. Susan, there is no question now. Your father wanted you to receive this. I nodded silently. Then David handed me another document recovered from the same folder. It was an internal routing sheet connected to the original delivery process. At the bottom appeared a handwritten note documenting the final transfer. And beside that note was a signature. The moment I saw the name, my entire understanding of the last 4 months changed. Because the person who handled the original letter before it disappeared was someone I knew very well. The signature at the bottom of the routing sheet belonged to Michael. I stared at the page for what felt like an eternity. My younger brother's name was written clearly beside the final transfer notation. There was no ambiguity, no question about what I was seeing. According to the records, Michael had personally signed for materials connected to the original delivery process. My first reaction was not anger. It was disbelief. Throughout the entire search, I had suspected that someone knew more than they admitted. Yet seeing proof was different from imagining possibilities. David remained quiet while I processed the information. Finally, he spoke. This does not prove he destroyed anything. I nodded slowly. No, but it proves he was involved. The distinction mattered. We still did not know exactly what happened to the original letter. We only knew that Michael had been part of the chain of custody. More importantly, he never disclosed that fact during any of our conversations. Over the next several days, David carefully organized the evidence. The copy of the letter, the storage records, the transfer authorization, the routing sheet, the notebook entry from my father's office. Individually, each item raised questions. Together, they formed a remarkably clear timeline. As the information circulated among the attorneys handling the estate, attitudes began to change. Relatives who once dismissed the missing letter as a misunderstanding suddenly wanted details. People who had avoided the subject now called asking what had been discovered. The truth was beginning to emerge whether anyone liked it or not. Then David scheduled a formal family meeting. Every major family member was invited. Michael agreed to attend. The meeting took place in the same conference room where Harold first mentioned the letter months earlier. This time the atmosphere felt entirely different. Nobody arrived expecting routine paperwork. Everyone understood that important questions were finally about to be addressed. Michael entered last. He looked tired, older than I remembered. When he sat down across from me, he avoided direct eye contact. David began by presenting the timeline. He reviewed the existence of the letter. He reviewed the preserved copy. He reviewed the storage records and transfer documentation. Nobody interrupted. Nobody challenged the evidence. Then David placed the routing sheet on the table. Silence filled the room. Michael stared at the document for several seconds. Finally, he exhaled slowly. "I knew this would eventually happen," he said. The room became completely still. My heart pounded. "Then tell us what happened," I said quietly. Michael rubbed his forehead before answering. "Dad asked me to help collect several documents during his final months." His voice sounded tired rather than defensive. "When the letter came up, I convinced myself it was not important." Several relatives exchanged shocked glances. Michael continued, "I never opened it. I never read it. But I knew it existed." Hearing those words felt almost surreal. For months, he denied knowing anything. Now he was admitting the opposite. "Why did you never tell me?" I asked. Michael looked down at the table. "Because after Dad passed away, everything became complicated. The estate process started. Family tensions grew. Then too much time passed." His answer was not dramatic. It was simply human. A series of bad decisions growing larger with every delay. David then revealed the copy of the letter and read several key passages aloud. My father's words filled the room once again. Honesty. Family unity. No secrets between his children. By the time David finished reading, several relatives had tears in their eyes. The truth was finally visible. Not just the existence of the letter. The values my father wanted remembered. As the meeting ended, nobody focused on blame. Instead, attention shifted toward honoring the wishes clearly expressed in the document. Yet one final step remained. The family still needed to decide how my father's message would be formally acknowledged. And that decision would determine how his legacy would be remembered for years to come. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. The conversation stopped being about a missing letter and started becoming about my father's legacy. Attorney David Reynolds prepared a formal record documenting the discovery of the preserved copy, the archive trail, and the circumstances surrounding its disappearance. The document was added to the estate file so that anyone reviewing the record in the future would understand what actually occurred. More importantly, my father's words would no longer remain hidden. During a final family gathering held at my father's home, relatives from across the state came together one last time before the property was sold. The atmosphere felt different from previous meetings. There was less tension, less suspicion. For the first time since my father's passing, people seemed willing to listen rather than argue. Michael arrived early. He looked nervous but determined. Before everyone else arrived, he asked if we could speak privately. We sat on the back porch where our father used to drink coffee every morning. For several minutes, neither of us said anything. Then Michael finally spoke. "I owe you an apology." His voice was quiet. Not because of one mistake. Because I kept making the same mistake every day after it happened. I listened without interrupting. I told myself I was avoiding conflict, he continued. But really I was avoiding responsibility. There was sadness in his expression that I had not seen before. Dad trusted me to help with his affairs. Instead of being honest when I realized the letter never reached you, I convinced myself it would not matter. I thought about everything that had happened over the previous months. The confusion, the questions, the unnecessary distance that grew between family members. Then I remembered the letter itself. My father had spent page after page talking about honesty, understanding, and family. He never asked us to be perfect. He asked us to be truthful. "I wish you had told me sooner," I said. Michael nodded. "So do I." It was not a dramatic reconciliation. There were no speeches, no grand gestures, just two aging siblings finally speaking honestly. Sometimes that is enough. Later that afternoon, David read selected portions of my father's letter aloud for the entire family. The room remained completely silent as his words filled the house one final time. When he reached the sentence that had guided the entire journey, I felt a lump form in my throat. The truth survives longer than secrets. This time, everyone heard it. This time, nobody could ignore it. After the reading ended, several relatives shared memories of my father. Stories I had never heard before. Small acts of kindness. Quiet moments of generosity. Practical advice he offered during difficult times. The gathering slowly transformed from a discussion about documents into a celebration of the man himself. As the sun began setting, I walked through the house alone. In the study, I paused beside the desk where I had discovered the notebook months earlier. The same notebook that led us toward the truth. I ran my hand across the surface and smiled. My father understood something many people never learn. Secrets may delay the truth, but they cannot erase it. Eventually, Honesty finds a way forward. Before leaving, I placed a framed copy of the letter on the bookshelf beside several family photographs. It felt like the right place for it. Not hidden away in storage. Not locked inside a file. Visible. Preserved. Remembered. When I finally closed the front door behind me, I felt something I had not felt since my father's passing. Peace. The letter did not change the estate. It did not change the past. But it restored something far more important. My father's voice had found its way home. And with it, so had the truth.